For decades, the Soviet Union terrified the world. It had more nuclear weapons than the United States, more tanks than all of Europe combined. A military so large that Western leaders believed it would last forever. And then it collapsed. Not after losing a war, not after being invaded, but while it still looked powerful. That's the part most people don't understand. Because the Soviet Empire didn't fail on the battlefield. It failed in places the cameras never showed. And here's why this matters today. Because the same patterns that cracked the Soviet Union are quietly appearing inside America right now. Different ideology, different system, same structural stress. To understand where America may be headed, we first need to understand how the Soviet Empire actually broke. Not the myths, not the propaganda, the real reason. For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union appeared unstoppable. It controlled nearly half of Europe. Its ideology reached Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Its military rivaled, and in some areas exceeded, American power. From the outside, it looked like a permanent superpower. But internally, the Soviet system was rotting. The core problem wasn't sanctions. It wasn't Western pressure. It wasn't even military overspending. Not at first. The real problem was how the system handled truth. In the Soviet economy, honesty was dangerous. Factories were given production quotas that were often impossible to meet. When targets weren't met, managers didn't report failure. They falsified success. Numbers went up on paper. Reality stayed the same, or got worse. This created a chain reaction. Local officials lied to regional officials. Regional officials lied to Moscow. And Moscow ended up believing a fantasy economy that didn't exist. On paper, productivity was rising. In real life, shelves were empty. On paper, innovation was happening. In real life, technology lagged decades behind the West. The Soviet system wasn't designed to fix mistakes. It was designed to hide them. And that's fatal for any large system. Because when a system punishes bad news doesn't disappear. It multiplies underground. At the same time, the Soviet Union poured enormous resources into military power. Tanks, missiles, space programs, global influence campaigns. The state believed strength abroad could compensate for weakness at home. But military power cannot replace economic vitality. Weapons don't feed people. Ideology doesn't repair infrastructure. Fear doesn't create innovation. As living standards stagnated, the public slowly stopped believing. The government still controlled elections, still controlled media, still controlled borders. But it lost control of something far more important: confidence. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union looked powerful on the surface, but was brittle underneath. The system had no mechanism for correction, no way to slow down, no way to admit mistakes without threatening itself. And that's when empires become fragile. Because strength without adaptability isn't strength. It's a delayed collapse. The Soviet Union didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it believed its own illusion of strength for too long. By the early 1980s, Soviet leaders finally understood something was wrong. Economic growth had slowed to a crawl. Consumer goods were scarce. The gap between the Soviet Union and the West was widening. But the real danger wasn't stagnation. It was that the system had been stagnant for so long that it no longer knew how to change without breaking. This is where Mikhail Gorbachev enters the story. When Gorbachev came to power, he didn't want to destroy the Soviet Union. He wanted to save it. His solution was reform. Two ideas became famous: perestroika, restructuring the economy; glasnost, openness in information and politics. On paper, these reforms made sense. The problem was timing. The Soviet system had survived for decades by suppressing truth. Reforms didn't strengthen the structure. They exposed how weak it already was. Glasnost allowed people to speak openly for the first time. And once truth was allowed, it didn't come out slowly. It flooded. People learned about past famines, corruption inside the party, environmental disasters that had been hidden for years, military failures the state had denied. Trust collapsed faster than the economy ever had. At the same time, perestroika weakened central control without creating a functioning market system to replace it. State factories lost clear authority. Prices became distorted. Supply chains broke down. The economy entered a dangerous in-between phase, not planned enough to be stable, not free enough to be efficient. And then there was the empire itself. For decades, Moscow had used force to keep Eastern Europe in line. But Gorbachev made a historic decision. He chose not to use tanks. Poland reformed. Hungary opened borders. East Germany cracked. Once the Soviet Union showed it would no longer enforce control, the empire began to unravel. This wasn't moral failure. It was structural reality. Empires don't survive on consent alone, and once force is removed, the cost of holding the system together becomes visible. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union faced a perfect storm: falling productivity, rising public anger, collapsing trust, shrinking control, and no economic buffer. The state was still armed, still nuclear, still feared, but it was no longer coherent. Reform didn't destroy the Soviet Union. It revealed that the foundation had already cracked. And this leads to an uncomfortable lesson. Empires don't fall when they refuse to change. They fall when they try to change too late. Because once confidence breaks, no reform moves fast enough to stop the collapse. One of the biggest myths about the Soviet collapse is that it happened suddenly. It didn't. The Soviet Union survived for years after it became unproductive. How? Power, military power, nuclear deterrence, control over energy, territory, and fear. Power allowed the system to delay consequences. But delay is not recovery. Every year the Soviet Union avoided reforming deeply, the imbalance grew larger. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy was already failing to keep up technologically. Factories produced quantity, not quality. Innovation lagged behind the West. Consumer life stagnated. Instead of fixing productivity, the system leaned on power projection. Military spending remained massive. Resources were diverted from civilian life to defense. Oil exports were used to plug budget holes. For a while it worked. High oil prices in the 1970s gave Moscow breathing room. The state could fund itself without changing the system. This is critical. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because it lacked resources. It collapsed because resources replaced reform. And when oil prices fell in the 1980s, the illusion ended. Suddenly, revenue shrank. Imports became harder to afford. Subsidies collapsed, debt pressure increased. The system had no shock absorbers. Power had masked fragility, but it had also prevented adaptation. Now look at what happened next. As economic stress increased, political unity weakened. Republics inside the USSR began asking a dangerous question. Why are we carrying this system? National identity reemerged. Local elites wanted control over their own resources. Central authority weakened further. This is where empires lose control, not through invasion, but through fragmentation. Moscow still had the army, but using it would have accelerated collapse, so power became unusable. This is the paradox of late-stage empires. The stronger they look, the fewer tools they can actually use. Now, here's the part that matters for today. The Soviet Union didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because productivity stopped growing. Legitimacy, eroded power substituted for reform, and debt and dependency quietly accumulated. Sound familiar? America today still dominates. Military reach, financial systems, global institutions. But like the Soviet Union, it increasingly uses power to buy time. Debt expands instead of shrinking. Structural problems are postponed, not resolved. Crises are managed, not fixed. And just like the USSR, the system still works, which is why the danger feels invisible. But history shows this clearly. When an empire relies on strength instead of adaptability, every year of delay increases the cost of collapse. The Soviet Union didn't lose because it faced enemies. It lost because time stopped being its ally. Here's what most people get wrong about the Soviet Union. They imagine collapse as chaos, riots, tanks, violence. But the most dangerous moment wasn't chaos, it was calm. By the late 1980s, the Soviet system hadn't exploded, it had frozen. Stores were empty, but order remained. Wages existed, but buying power didn't. Institutions functioned, but meaning was gone. This is the phase when systems die quietly. The government still issued commands. The army still existed. The flag still flew. But belief was gone, and belief is what holds empires together. When Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, the goal wasn't to destroy the system, it was to save it. But reforms came too late, and worse, they revealed the truth. People saw how inefficient the economy really was, how corrupt the bureaucracy had become, how far behind the West they had fallen. Transparency didn't fix the problem, it exposed it. And once people see reality, you can't put the illusion back. This is the most fragile moment for any empire. Not when people are angry, but when they stop believing improvement is possible. That's when compliance breaks. The Soviet Union didn't face mass rebellion everywhere. It faced something worse, withdrawal. Workers stopped caring, officials stopped enforcing, republics stopped cooperating. The system wasn't attacked, it was abandoned. Now here's the critical insight. The Soviet leadership still had power, still had weapons, still had control mechanisms, but using them would have destroyed what little legitimacy remained. So they hesitated. And hesitation in a collapsing system is fatal. By 1991, the USSR didn't fall because of a single decision. It fell because no one believed in defending it anymore. Not the people, not the regions, not even parts of the elite. When the final moment came, there was no dramatic battle, just signatures, resignations, and silence. Now connect this to the present. Modern empires don't collapse loudly, they lose. Policy flexibility, public trust, economic resilience. First, only later do symbols fall. Today, America still looks strong. Markets function. Institutions operate. The military dominates. But cracks don't announce themselves. They show up as permanent emergency policies, rising debt, replacing reform polarization, replacing consensus power, replacing trust. Just like the late Soviet phase, everything still works. And that's why people dismiss comparisons. But history shows the calm before collapse isn't peace, it's exhaustion. When systems run on momentum instead of belief, they can persist, but they can't recover. Here's the final truth about the Soviet collapse, and why this pattern matters more today than ever before. The Soviet Union didn't die because it was invaded. It didn't fall because of a single bad leader, and it didn't collapse the day the flag came down. It died earlier, the moment it lost the ability to adapt. That is the real ending of empires. By the time the USSR officially dissolved in December 1991, the system had already accepted defeat internally. Ministries existed, but no longer coordinated. The military existed, but had no clear mission. The economy existed, but nobody trusted it. The state still had power, but power without legitimacy becomes unusable. That's the final stage, when force exists, but can't be applied without destroying what remains. And this is where the pattern completes. Every empire reaches a point where its greatest strength becomes its greatest trap. For the Soviet Union, it was centralized control. For Rome, it was overexpansion and debased money. For Britain, it was currency dominance without economic backing. And for America, it's global responsibility backed by debt, trust, and momentum, all at the same time. The U.S. today doesn't face collapse, it faces constraint. And constraint is more dangerous than weakness, because constrained systems react instead of choose. They spend instead of reform. They escalate instead of adapt. They manage narratives instead of fixing structures. That's exactly what late-stage Soviet leadership did. Every problem became temporary. Every fix became cosmetic. Every delay increased the final cost. And when the moment of truth arrived, there were no good options left, only less bad ones. The Soviet Union reached a point where reform threatened collapse, force threatened legitimacy, delay threatened survival, so the system froze. And frozen systems don't survive modern pressure. Now look at the modern world. Markets are faster. Debt compounds instantly. Information spreads globally in minutes. Capital moves without loyalty. This means modern empires get less time to correct mistakes than any empire before. There is no slow decline anymore. There is compression. This is why the Soviet comparison isn't about ideology. It's about structure. When a system relies on confidence more than productivity, uses power to replace trust, treats debt as a solution instead of a cost. It enters the same danger zone, still strong, still feared, still functional, but no longer flexible. And flexibility is the real currency of survival. The Soviet Union didn't lose because the West won. It lost because it couldn't change fast enough without breaking itself. That's the lesson. Empires don't fall when they're challenged. They fall when adapting becomes more dangerous than staying the same. America's future isn't predetermined, but the pattern is visible. And history is clear about one thing. Ignoring patterns doesn't make them disappear. It just makes them more expensive. This isn't a prediction, it's a map. What comes next depends on whether lessons are learned on or repeated. And that choice is always made before collapse is obvious, not after. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, subscribe.